Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tracing what is easily one of the most consequential chain reactions in modern history. We're talking about a 4-decade domino effect that completely reshaped Afghanistan and, honestly, the entire globe. So if you've ever wondered how the geopolitical maneuvers of the 20th century literally paved the way for the conflicts of the 21st, well, you are in the exact right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. How in the world did a Cold War proxy battle between superpowers inadvertently birth the Taliban? It's a fascinating and frankly tragic mystery of unintended consequences. We're going to trace the historical breadcrumbs together to see exactly how foreign interventions, which were really just designed to solve immediate geopolitical problems, ended up creating devastating modern crises. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with Afghanistan before the storm, move into the Soviet attack and that Cold War proxy battlefield, examine the post-Soviet power vacuum, and then finish up with the rise of the Taliban and their legacy of radicalization.
All right, Part 1, Afghanistan before the storm. Let's look at the pre-invasion landscape.
So, imagine a country split right down the middle, not by a physical wall, but by a completely different way of life. In the mid-20th century, Afghanistan was defined by this incredibly stark geographic divide. On one side, you've got the capital city, Kabul. The state apparatus there was working hard to engineer a modern state, pushing for secularization and trying to impose this somewhat authoritarian modernization. But then, on the flip side, you have the vast rural population. Their lives were deeply rooted in conservative tribal customs like Pashtunwali and traditional Islam. The government in Kabul barely penetrated this rural world, and this city versus countryside cleavage, it's absolutely crucial for understanding everything that happens next.
Let's move to the timeline, because things unravel fast. For 50 years, Afghanistan was a pretty stable constitutional monarchy. But boom, in 1973, a coup ends the monarchy and establishes a republic. Fast forward just 5 years to 1978, and we get the SAW Revolution. This was a communist coup led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA. They violently tried to force radical secularization and land redistribution, which, as you can probably guess, the conservative rural population violently rejected. Facing this massive internal revolt, the ruling Communist Party started to collapse. And that brings us to the fatal catalyst in 1979, the Soviet Union invasion. Which brings us to Section 2, the Soviet Union attacks. A grueling 10-year conflict begins.
Just look at this number, 115,000. By 1983, that's how many Soviet troops were on the ground in Afghanistan. It's a staggering footprint. Now, they easily seized the cities and the main infrastructure, sure, but the rural countryside? Totally different story. Here's the crazy part. You've got this technically advanced superpower, right? But the Soviet military was woefully unprepared for the reality of Afghanistan. They were completely unsuited for counterinsurgency in that harsh, mountainous terrain. Soviet troops mostly stayed roadbound. They were super reliant on hiding behind armor, and they were really casualty shy. So what happens? Instead of breaking the resistance, their brutal tactics completely backfire. Because they wouldn't go into the mountains, they relied heavily on saturation bombing, scorched earth campaigns, and literally millions of landmines. All this did was utterly alienate the rural population and pour gasoline on their resentment.
Moving right along to Section 3, a Cold War proxy battlefield. This is where foreign intervention really ramps up.
The conflict, almost overnight, expands into this massive global proxy war. It's like a deadly chessboard. On one side, you have the Soviets propping up the Afghan communist government. On the other side, the Mujahideen. Now, these were fragmented, armed resistance groups, really only united by one thing: kicking out foreign forces. But, and this is key, they were not fighting alone. They were backed by a heavy-hitting coalition: the United States via the CIA, Pakistan via its intelligence agency, the ISI, and Saudi Arabia.
And to really grasp the sheer scale of this foreign involvement, you just have to look at this number: $2 billion. That is the amount of aid, weapons, and training funneled directly into the Afghan resistance by the U.S. and its allies through Operation Cyclone. And it was heavily coordinated on the ground by Pakistan's ISI. The goal for America and its allies was incredibly simple: bleed the Soviet Union dry. But, funneling that much firepower with zero long-term oversight on who exactly was getting the weapons, that was going to have some massive repercussions. And this brilliantly illustrates what it actually looked like on the ground. At Shawar, the Mujahideen basically used the harsh, unforgiving terrain to launch highly effective guerrilla attacks against conventional Soviet forces. Using ambushes, sabotage, hit-and-run tactics, these seemingly ill-equipped tribesmen managed to bleed a literal superpower, ultimately forcing the Soviets to pack up and withdraw in 1989.
Part 4. The Post-Soviet Power Vacuum. The Descent into Civil War.
So the Soviets leave, but it doesn't bring peace. Instead, it leaves this absolute, gaping power vacuum. Without that unifying enemy to fight, the heavily armed Mujahideen factions, the ones America and Pakistan just spent billions arming, immediately turn their weapons on each other. Afghanistan just plunges into a devastating civil war. We're talking unchecked lawlessness, brutal warlordsism, rampant corruption. The whole country was practically ripped apart by regional commanders fighting over the ruins.
Which sets the stage for Section 5, the rise of the Taliban. A brand new force emerges from the chaos.
You know, the word Taliban is actually Pashto for students, and that's literal. This movement was born out of religious students, a lot of whom had grown up in refugee camps and studied over in Pakistani madrasas, or Islamic seminaries. Led by an Islamic scholar named Mullah Muhammad Omar, these young men, many who had actually fought in the anti-Soviet jihad, were just sick and tired of the warlord corruption destroying their home. Their goal? Impose a strict, uncompromising interpretation of Sharia law to end the violence once and for all.
And their rise was like wildfire. Let's trace this breathtakingly rapid military expansion. It starts in late 1994, capturing the border town of Spin Boldak. Why does that matter? It gave them a direct supply line and weapons straight from Pakistan. By November 94, they seized Kandahar, basically walking in, because the population was just so desperate for order. By September 95, they take Herat. And then, exactly a year later, in September 1996, they conquer the capital, Kabul, and declare the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is realizing the Taliban absolutely did not do this alone. Remember Pakistan? They viewed a stable Afghanistan as essential for their own trade routes, so their intelligence agency provided crucial financing, logistical support, and sanctuary to the Taliban. I mean, Pakistan's interior minister at the time literally referred to the Taliban as "my boys." It just perfectly captures how deeply intertwined this movement was with its foreign sponsors.
Finally, Section 6, a legacy of radicalization, the global fallout.
The unintended consequences of this proxy war, they are staggering. Millions of Afghan refugees in Pakistan underwent generational radicalization in state-supported schools. During the war against the Soviets, the US and Pakistani intelligence purposefully favored and funded the most hardline, uncompromising factions simply because they were the most fierce fighters. But once those factions were in power, that rigid ideology alienated the entire world. The Taliban ends up providing a safe haven to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And that, as we all know, led directly to the tragic attacks of September 11, 2001, which triggered the US invasion that dismantled the Taliban's first regime in just months.
So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with this really provocative question to reflect on. How did the geopolitical fixes for a 20th century Cold War become the exact catalyst for a 21st century global crisis? The billions in weapons funneled by America to stop the Soviets, and the religious schools funded by Pakistan to train resistance fighters, they directly birthed the very forces that would drag the world back into Afghanistan for another 20 years. It's a pretty stark reminder that in geopolitics, the enemy of your enemy today might just be the exact crisis you're facing tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.